around and look at the back, it's a fairly simple and well designed layout here. Basically what we have is, this is the AM FM tuner board here. This is the audio input board. This is intercom control and power supply. And in fact, if we get a little adventuresome here, we don't normally take sets apart when it's an overview. However, since we have to work on this, that's the next thing I'm doing today, we can take it apart a little bit. It's a nice design in that, as far as I can tell, the majority of the boards simply unplug. That's almost all of that one. And then we have the tuner board down here. These sets seem to be fairly well constructed. Yes, I have had this one apart once already because I needed to look at it to figure out what parts I needed to order for it. Ah, there we go. So for instance, the audio board, it just unplugs and comes out of the set. One of the things that's interesting about these sets is, for as old as this is, let's say it's 1989, 88, 89, I know they came out around 86 or 87, these boards, and it's true for all of them except for this one, these boards are seriously like behind the times for their day. The thing that makes them that way, and I found it interesting and somewhat, I'm not going to say shocking or disturbing because that's really too harsh, but these are not very modern circuit boards in some respects. One, on the top side of the board, these are single-sided boards with all through-hole components. There's no silkscreen component designations on the board whatsoever. As an example, I just happen to have this here on the bench. Here's a NuTone chime module. NuTone chime modules first came out in 1984, and if you look carefully, if I can keep the sun off of it, you can see all the component designations around all the components on the board. That's all silk screened on, and it makes my job easier because if I have to replace a part, it tells me exactly what the part is. It, like things for capacitors and diodes and so forth, transistors, it shows the orientation of the parts. So if you have to replace it, you know, if you take the part out, you get a phone call, you got to come back, you can remember how it goes because there's a diagram that shows you that. Also on the back side of the board, we'll go back to the music and sound board. If we turn it over on the back, it's a tin plate board. You can see all the shiny silver, that's solder, and underneath the solder are copper traces that make up the circuitry of the circuit board, and this is what's commonly referred to as a tin plate board. You have the copper has been etched away to create the paths, and then solder was flowed over it. The solder would have been flowed over it after all the components would have been put in place, and then it goes through a wave machine with solder and it solders it all at one time. It's kind of interesting because this is really more like what you see in equipment that was made in the 70s. Not so much modern for like 1989. So here we'll go back to our chime module, and this is the back side of the board. And if you look carefully, you can see, oh, it's green. And you can see all the shiny little silver solder points all over the board. The green is what's called solder mask. And if you look carefully, if I hold it up, like in this area under the microprocessor right here, you can see the copper traces underneath the green solder mask. The purpose of the solder mask is to prevent the solder from bridging across connections and going where it doesn't belong. It resists, you can't solder on solder mask, hence the masking part. This board would have been assembled the same way. All the components would have been put in place, and it would go through a wave soldering machine, and all of this gets soldered at one time, but you don't have to worry about solder bridging across connections because the solder mask prevents that. This kind of board, it's more likely you could possibly have solder bridges because there's nothing to prevent the solder from flowing into other points that are very close to each other as it goes through the machine. It seems kind of odd that at this point in time, this is still how these kind of boards were made. So I found that kind of interesting. The other thing about that, when you work on a set like this, is it makes it very difficult to figure out, you know, if you have to replace a resistor, let's say that one right there, okay, which resistor is that? I don't know. There's no component. It's not R114 because there's no number next to it, so you don't know. So even if you have a schematic, you have to look at the schematic very carefully, and you have to kind of sort through the drawing of the schematic and relate it to what you see on the board here physically to try to figure out what it is. And it's not very good. When products are designed, there is a certain amount of design for repair that should be brought into the equation, and these boards don't look like they got any consideration for the poor guy like me who has to try to work on them. Anyway, that's just my 2 cents worth on that. So we can unplug this. This is the audio board. This is made in a similar way. There is no silk screening or component designation on the top side of the board, but if I look underneath here, because I'm not taking this off right now, you can see there is green solder mask on this board. So it may be that this board was manufactured, in fact this is code dated May 2nd, 1989. You can see it's right here, I think. And maybe this board was not manufactured in the same facility as this one. Maybe it came from a company with a pre-made board or something like that. I don't know. And then we have the main board here on the back. And I like this design in some respects. We do have to take the knobs off the front. They just pull off. And now if we very carefully, we can wiggle this up and it unplugs. And here's our power supply, amplification, and intercom control board. The 4 adjustments for the system-wide adjustments, master speaker volume, intercom volume, system volume, and tone, they are mounted to this board and stick through openings in the faceplate. Again, it's a tin-plated board, no solder mask, and on this side, no component designations whatsoever. So you kind of have to make out what it is that you're working on here, because that makes it a little bit more challenging. The thing that's interesting is if we look at the rest of this board, which is the switchboard assembly, it's the ones with the room control switches and these on it that this power supply amplifier board plugs into. This has solder mask on it and is made in a more modern way. This is code dated the 37th week of 1988. And then down here we have what's referred to in the music and sound service manual as the computer board. And this is the board that translates the button presses on the front of the panel for the direct access tuning and other features into information that the other parts of the set can use. So this is referred to as the computer board. And in fact, we're going to take a second here and take this out. And we'll unplug this cable and we'll lift this out. So here's our computer board. And this is a microprocessor. Which microprocessor is it? I'm not sure exactly. I've done a little bit of research and I haven't been able to figure out which one it is exactly. But this microprocessor is what's responsible for all of the tuning functions and audio inputs and things on the system. It's fairly well established that if this goes bad, there are no replacements and this will never work properly again. It may be that the display works and so forth, but for the most part, and this comes from someone that I believe because he's been working on music and sound systems a lot longer than I have, if the microprocessor goes bad or the firmware that's inside of it becomes corrupted, this is not a repairable module any longer. So that's a real problem. I also understand that in those cases, you can still use the door chime function and you can still use the intercom function, but no radio. The other thing on this is, on this side are all of the buttons, and this is the button board. And I made a video recently where I showed how to replace these tactile switches on a music and sound N440. I talked about how the buttons collapse and so on and so on. This one has all of those problems. In fact, that was reported to me by the owner of the set, that the buttons, some of them don't work, and a lot of them, you have to push them really hard to get them to do anything. All of these little switches are going to get replaced. That's going to be in a separate and different video. Now that we've taken Joshua's set all apart, I'm not going to put it back together for you because I got to fix it, and that's going to be a different video. So that's briefly sort of an overview. Oh, and I guess we should do this. One of the nice things about this is, unlike other music and sound systems, they have these multi-wire cable assemblies. These, you have a blue plug, a red plug, a green plug, and on this one, there's a white plug, and on this one, the tuner board, there's a little white plug. That's for your antenna connections and that kind of stuff. These are the cables and connectors that plug into the terminal board, which mount in the back of the wall housing inside the wall. An N440 is a 6-wire system. Get it? 6 wires, 6. All of those wires are terminated on the terminal board back in the wall housing, and then you simply plug the master into sockets on the terminal board. And that's a good design compared to like an N350, where all the wires are connected to terminals on the back of the set, which makes taking it apart a lot more to do. So this is a good design in that respect. Seems to be a fairly well-made unit. That's just a brief overview of an N440. Watch for the next video where I actually fix it. Oh, and if you want to see what happened to it, just real briefly, because this is not a repair video, here's the burnt mark on the board with the burn that goes up to the edge of the board. This is primarily, I think, just smoke damage from this, where it blew up. And corresponding on this side is we have a capacitor right here, this one, that exploded. Why did it explode? That's not clear at the moment. Perhaps I'll figure out more once I start the repair. But anyway, that's a brief overview of a music and sound N440 from the late 1980s. We'll see what we can do to repair and renew and rebuild it and make it work as good as new. I hope you found this interesting, and perhaps for someone it will be helpful. If it is, give it a thumbs up on YouTube, because that helps us just a little bit. There'll be a banner right here that shows you how to subscribe. Go to our YouTube homepage, click on the bell, and when you click on the bell, click on it to receive all notifications, and every time we post a new video, you'll get a notification and you can watch it. That's all for today. See you on the next video.